Swearing-in ceremony for new Representative Suzanne Bonamici of Oregon, who won the special election last week for the seat formerly held by David Wu. Now live House coverage here on C-SPAN.
House will be in order. The prayer will be offered by the guest chaplain, Reverend Jeffrey Astrachan, Temple Beth Israel, York, Pennsylvania.
Almighty source of strength, peace, and compassion, I stand humbly before you to ask your blessing upon those who serve our great nation, to all who dedicate themselves to its prosperity and security. Grant to each member of this House the wisdom and vision to look steadfastly toward our future, to labor earnestly for the welfare of all, and to consider wholeheartedly the passion and sacrifice of those who came before us, who helped to preserve and foster the noblest ideals for which our nation stands. Today, especially, we consider the valor of those 4 Army chaplains whose selfless acts of heroism 69 years ago not only saved the lives of others, but inspire us to serve in our own day, to continue our partnership in your ever-unfolding acts of creation on earth. May the memories of the 4 chaplains and the ideals for which they lived ever remain a blessing, and let us say, Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Turner. I pledge allegiance to the flag. To the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Without objection, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Platts, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honored to host our guest chaplain, Rabbi Jeffrey Astrachan, to give today's opening prayer. Rabbi Astrachan is here today to help honor the sacrifice of the 4 chaplains who gave their lives during the sinking of the troop ship Dorchester during World War II. This is especially significant because one of the 4 chaplains, Lieutenant Alexander D. Good, was once a rabbi with the same congregation in York, Pennsylvania, my hometown, that Rabbi Astrachan now serves. Along with the rabbi, I'm pleased to take this opportunity to recognize the courageous sacrifice made 62 years ago by the 4 chaplains, 69 years ago by the 4 chaplains. The Dorchester was torpedoed off the coast of Greenland. Only 230 of the over 900 men on board survived. The survivors recounted the story of the heroic actions of the 4 chaplains of different faiths: Lieutenant Good, Lieutenant John Washington, a Catholic priest, and Lieutenants George Fox and Clark Poling, 2 Protestant ministers. These 4 servants of God spent their last 18 minutes in this life helping their fellow passengers to safety. When there were no more life jackets to hand out, the chaplains removed their own and gave them to shipmates. They were last seen on the hull of the ship, arm in arm, in prayer as the ship sank into the icy waters. Chaplains Hill at Arlington National Cemetery is home to several memorials to chaplains. Last year, the United States House of Representatives adopted legislation to include a memorial to the 14 Jewish chaplains who gave their lives in World War II and the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Today we honor not just the 4 chaplains of the Dorchester, but the sacrifices and selflessness made by military chaplains of all faiths. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The Chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives, Sir, pursuant to the permission granted in Clause 2H of Rule 2 of the Rules of the U.S. House of Representatives, the Clerk received the following message from the Secretary of the Senate on February 7, 2012, at 10:40 a.m. that the Senate passed with an amendment H.R. 347, that the Senate passed Senate 1794. With best wishes, I am, signed sincerely, Karen L. Haas.
The chair will entertain up to 15 further requests for one-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on January the 4th, the President abused executive authority and appointed 3 new members of the National Labor Relations Board, claiming a recess appointment, but the Senate was not in recess. By making this decision, the President ignored the Senate's confirmation and vetting practice, which is outlined by Article 1, Section 5 of the United States Constitution. Earlier today, the House Education and Workforce Committee, ably led by Chairman John Klein, held a hearing on this unconstitutional conduct. The President has used the National Labor Relations Board as a big labor bully to advance his political agenda and threaten the jobs of America's small businesses. Due to the legal uncertainty by the President's appointments, each decision reached by the Board could allow for legal challenges costing job creators and taxpayers more money. House Republicans will work to protect hard-working taxpayers from this administration's failed policies which are destroying jobs. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget the 4 chaplains and September 11th in the global war on terrorism.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition? Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the clock is ticking on extending the payroll tax cut and unemployment benefits for millions of Americans. In just 3 short weeks, people barely surviving on unemployment benefits will be out on the streets. In 3 short weeks, 160 million people who get paychecks would have to pay the government nearly $1,000 more. Unfortunately, House Republican leadership insists on unrelated ideological legislation freezing the pay of middle-class public servants for a 3rd time in 3 years, slashing unemployment benefits by 40 weeks, and drug testing Americans who've lost their jobs through no fault of their own. I don't think my Republican colleagues understand the plight of Americans who've lost their jobs through no fault of their own. So I'm asking my constituents and people from around the country to go to my website, karenbass.house.gov, and send in stories about their efforts to look for work. I will share these stories with my Republican colleagues to help them understand in hopes they will do the right thing. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition? Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
This year's tribute to our lost 4 chaplains, last seen on the decks of the USAT Dorchester, offering comfort and their only chance for survival to others, is particularly poignant. For it was this past year that these men were reunited at this country's most hallowed grounds, Arlington National Cemetery. With the recognition long overdue of Rabbi Alexander D. Good and all the Jewish war chaplains who have served this nation in faith, the 4 chaplains stand watch once again over their flock from Chaplain's Hill. Providence most definitely brought them together after history attempted to break their bond. And so, 69 years later, we reinforce the bonds of faith that no man can break and pay our respects to Chaplains Fox, Poling, Washington, and Rabbi Good, and honor their sacrifice to our great nation.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition? Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 years ago this week, an unspeakable tragedy occurred when a plane full of people who were dearly loved by their families crashed into a home in Clarence Center in my district. The cause was pilot fatigue and inexperience. And the cruel irony that had occurred over Valentine's Day weekend was lost on no one. Yet out of those ashes, Mr. Speaker, arose an indomitable spirit among these families that united them in their grief and brought their quest right here to the halls in Washington. They wanted to ensure that no other family had to endure having their hearts ripped out the way they all had. They never took no for an answer, they never gave up, and they inspired Congress to work in a bipartisan way to pass historic flight safety reform rules. That's why I'm joining with my colleagues from Western New York to introduce a resolution and honor them. the victims of the crash, and thank the surviving families of 3407, and to call on the administration to finish the work they started to implement these necessary FAA rules. Until the will of Congress and the families we served is translated into new rules, we will not give up the fight, because the families are counting us and they never gave up the fight. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the past month, I've heard from many of my constituents about the closing of the contract post office in my district, the South Temple Post Office. My constituents enjoy going to the South Temple Post Office because it is fast, efficient, and the service is outstanding. However, the United States Postal Service recently announced they would be closing this office along with 19 other contract postal units. Why? Because these contract post offices are not hiring enough union workers or allegedly taking union jobs away from the main branches. In other words, even though the United States Postal Service was $8.5 billion in the hole in 2010, and the owner of the South Temple office sent a check of $1 million every year to the Postal Services under their contract, they have decided to close it because of union dispute. This is just plain wrong. My constituents should have a choice of what post office they want to use and use the one that serves them the best. And if the privately owned contract office is performing better, they should be able to use that privately owned contract office. Rest assured, I will fight this nonsense and try to get this office left open. Yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition? Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today along with my colleague, Congresswoman Kathy Hochul, to recognize the upcoming 3rd anniversary of the tragic crash of Continental Connection Flight 3407 in my Western New York community. This tragedy, unfortunately, was preventable. The National Transportation Safety Board found that the chief cause of the crash was pilot error. In August of 2010, President Obama signed into law aviation safety legislation, which, among other things, required the Federal Aviation Administration to update flight and duty time rules and set minimum requirements, rest requirements for pilots. As the families know too well, the passage of time never really heals the tragic memory of that day. But they persevered. They became a true citizen army for aviation safety and achieved the most comprehensive aviation reform in 50 years. These efforts, they were guided by their faith and by the light of those they loved and lost. We recognize their extraordinary efforts on behalf of the Western New York community, the flying public, and a grateful nation. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition? Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my fellow colleagues, it is a distinct pleasure to stand before you right now, not only as a representative, but as a fan. I would like to take a few moments and acknowledge the New York Giants for defeating the New England Patriots Sunday night, 21-17, in Super Bowl 46. Some believe them to be underdogs, but our beloved G-men didn't let people's lack of faith or doubt distract them from their end goal. Instead, they showed New York's resilience by fighting back to regain the lead in the fourth quarter, earning their 2nd Super Bowl title in the last 5 years and 4th Super Bowl title overall. The Giants have won 8 world championships and rank as one of the most successful football franchises of all time. As Giant head coach Tom Coughlin said after the game, all things are possible for those who believe. And these guys believed, and they came together and trusted each other and believed in one another. I think this is a terrific message for everyone to think about, especially those of us holding the distinct honor of being members of the House of Representatives. There's still a great deal of work to be done on behalf of the American people. We must come together for a joint purpose. We must give our constituents a reason to believe we can work together on their behalf. Just as the members of the Giant team played hard for the people of New York, we must work hard for our constituents. Again, I would like to congratulate the New York Giants head coach Tom Coughlin, Super Bowl 46 MVP Eli Manning, and all the great fans in New York. Thank you. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition? The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this day marks a sad anniversary for many of the folks I represent. 4 years ago today, a combustible dust explosion destroyed the Imperial Sugar Plant in Fort Wentworth, Georgia, killing 14 people and injuring more than 40 others. The sad truth is that this explosion didn't have to happen. Experts have known about the dangers of combustible dust for decades, and experts have developed industry standards that can prevent the combustible dust explosions and fires. Unfortunately, these common sense practices have not become the national standard, despite preventable explosions and fires in Georgia and throughout America before and since. Today, on the 4th anniversary of this tragedy, I ask my colleagues to support H.R. 522, the Worker Protection Against Combustible Dust Explosions and Fires Act of 2011, introduced by Mr. Miller of California. This law would require the Secretary of Labor to promulgate standards for regulating combustible dust. We shouldn't wait until another disaster strikes. We owe it to the dead and the wounded to take action today so that disasters like the Imperial Sugar explosion will never happen again. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition? Does the gentleman ask for unanimous consent?
Yes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak about an issue that's deeply important to me, not as a Republican or a Democrat, but as a Catholic American. President Obama's Department of Health and Human Services announced it will require religious institutions like Catholic schools, Catholic hospitals, and Catholic charities to cover services that violate their core beliefs, like contraception, sterilization, and the morning after pill. Catholic schools like Notre Dame will be forced to pay millions in penalties if they don't comply with the federal government mandate. Now, this is about much more than just contraception. This is about Catholic schools and Catholic hospitals having to sacrifice conscience to comply with Obamacare. I believe that this is a clear violation of the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment of the Constitution, and what's worse, I believe that this is a move by the Obama administration to establish secularism over religion. That would strike at the core of the religious liberty of the Constitution and who we are as Americans. It's just one more reason why Obamacare is bad law and it needs to be repealed. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
That's 1 minute.
Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent?
Well, if it's necessary, yes.
Without objection.
I thank the gentleman. Ronald Reagan signed legislation that funded transit out of the Highway Trust Fund. The new Republican majority is going to end transit's eligibility for Highway Trust Fund dollars. But they've created an alternative transportation account that will be paid for out of the general fund. Only problem is paying for transit at current levels under an alternative scenario would blow another $40 billion hole in the budget. But they have a plan. They're going to require federal employees to pay 6% of their salary into a trust fund. That's about $40 billion over 5 years. But they're not taxing federal employees to pay for transit. Don't worry about that, because that money can't be spent on transit. But it'll make it look like they are, not spending more money. In reality, they will borrow $40 billion to pay for transit instead of paying for it with user fees out of the Highway Trust Fund, but they're going to pretend that they didn't add more money to the deficit. At the same time, make federal employees set aside 6% of their salary into a trust fund for this illusory offset. Good work, guys.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition? Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we have within our grasp the opportunity to boldly address two of America's greatest challenges, energy security and unemployment. These two issues are inextricably linked. We can no longer tolerate a stagnant, slow-growth economy that's saddled with historic unemployment rates and a dangerous dependence on foreign oil. A key solution to these problems is energy, specifically American energy. The President said in this House that we must have an all-of-the-above strategy to energy independence. I agree. That includes harvesting the energy in every corner of America, including the 3.8 billion barrels of oil and gas off the coast of Virginia. Last week, I introduced the Mid-Atlantic Energy and Jobs Act of 2012 to free up Virginia's abundant offshore energy. This legislation will help us achieve energy independence and could produce more than 18,000 local jobs. And it requires a significant amount of the royalties produced by the exploration to go toward improving our environment. The time to act is now, in this Congress, this President. We're Americans. Let's do this. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition? Gentlelady from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to address the need for jobs in this country. On Wednesday, we will have reached 400 days since the Republicans took control of the House without a jobs bill, even though my colleagues and I have been calling for and demanding action. The President has set forth a jobs plan that would allow Americans to get to work and for us to invest in this great country. By focusing on improving our infrastructure, fixing our roads, schools, and bridges, by providing incentives to hire veterans, by giving small businesses the support they need to grow and expand, and by cutting payroll taxes for 160 million workers to leave more money in the pockets of consumers. The members of Delta Sigma Theta sorority are on the Hill this week to be a voice for the jobless, to ask Congress to do what is best for the interest of Americans still trying to find jobs. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in supporting job growth and investment in this nation now. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise in support of national school choice because we need to offer our children effective education opportunities. And in Michigan, despite spending just shy of $10,000 annually to educate each child, we need to look at a couple of facts. One, only 31% of 8th graders are actually considered proficient in math. The other element that is very disheartening to me is the fact that one child drops out of school in America every 26 seconds. We have an obligation to give to parents the tools and resources to get their children out of bad educational environments and into better ones. As a member of Congress, I support school choice and allowing states to even opt out of the No Child Left Behind program and use educational resources in a way best to meet their local needs, not the demands of Washington, D.C. It should be up to parents, not governments, to choose what's best for their children. Better traditional schools, public charter schools, private schools, virtual education, and homeschooling. I personally advocate for these opportunities when I sat on the board of a public charter school in Michigan. Also, as I served as Director of Development at Zeeland Christian Schools, and most importantly, as I was a parent along with my wife who homeschooled our children. Those of us in Congress must continue to encourage and champion school reform. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to honor the incredible story of the USAT Dorchester's 4 chaplains. The brave immortal chaplains, a Jewish rabbi, a Catholic priest, and 2 Protestant ministers, selflessly provided comfort and guidance to their interfaith community aboard the transport ship as it sunk into icy waters on February 3, 1943. These leaders of different faiths gave up their life jackets and stood strong, singing prayers and hymns, sharing words of healing and peace as the ship went down. We are so fortunate to have Rabbi Astrakhan here with us today to help honor their sacred memory. Rabbi Astrakhan currently serves the same congregation in York, Pennsylvania, where Rabbi Good, one of the 4 chaplains, once served, continuing to honor his legacy. The 4 chaplains, Reverend George Fox, Rabbi Alexander Good, Father John Washington, and Reverend Clark Poling, serve as inspirations in their military service and their sacrifice for our country. Their quintessentially American tale of faith and courage now has an ending we can proudly commemorate, as all 4 of these men are honored and memorialized together on Chaplain's Hill at Arlington National Cemetery. For nearly 200 years, our nation's breathtaking military cemetery has been a place to honor all of America's fallen soldiers, providing the sacred and majestic setting fitting to our nation's heroes. Thanks to the dedication of many of my colleagues, we now have monuments on Chaplain's Hill to each of these faith groups where we can honor their sacrifice together. This is a testament to the courage and commitment of all who have served our nation in this way, and I am so honored to share in this observance with chaplains, members of the military, veterans, religious community advocates, family, and friends. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Tennessee seek recognition?
Request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm here today to talk about my bill, H.R. 3842, a bill that would prohibit the Obama administration from filing lawsuits against Arizona, South Carolina, Alabama, and other states over their immigration enforcement laws. In the last 3 years, 8 states have adopted immigration enforcement measures to address the illegal alien populations in their states. And in response, the Department of Justice and Eric Holder have pursued unprecedented lawsuits against these states. Mr. Speaker, there are over 10 million unauthorized aliens in this country, and states must be able to enforce the law if the federal government refuses to. And states should not have to live in fear of federal retribution for trying to keep their citizens safe. My bill, H.R. 3842, would deny the Obama administration and Eric Holder the funding for these meritless lawsuits. Until the Supreme Court decides the case against Arizona's SB 1070, Congress must use our power of the purse to stop these political lawsuits and allow states to uphold the law. I yield back my time.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
Consent to address the House for 1 minute, please.
Gentlelady from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everybody's talking about Chrysler's Super Bowl commercial, Halftime in America. It featured Clint Eastwood relating the recovery of the American automobile industry. That inspirational ad has now gone viral as people share its positive message about our country and our workers. Trust me, Mr. Speaker, in America's heartland, we know about hard times. Our people have been through a lot these last few years, but that commercial has it right. We took a punch, but we're still standing. President Obama made a bet on America's workers and companies, and it saved thousands of jobs. It saved our industry. This country can't be knocked out with one punch, Clint Eastwood says. We get right back up again. And when we do, the world is going to hear the roar of our engines. You can already hear that roar in Toledo. We're building Jeeps day and night. You can hear it in Lorain, too, and Sandusky, Avon Lake, Brook Park, and Parma. We're going to win this competition, and we're going to win it with teamwork, and we're going to win it because we want it more. Gentlemen and gentleladies, start your engines. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
To ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Gentlelady from California is recognized.
I hear over and over from small businesses that the one thing they need in these tough times is customers. And who is the biggest customer? The federal government. Each year, the government spends $500 billion on federal contracts, but only 20% is going to small firms. Small businesses create 2 out of every 3 new jobs. So for us to grow the economy, we have to give small businesses a bigger slice of the federal contracting pie. Today, I am introducing the Building Better Business Partnerships Act. This bill will help small firms break into federal contracting by making it easier for them to join mentor-protege programs. These programs partner small businesses with companies already contracting with government. It gives small firms a foot in the door so they can navigate the federal process, get experience on a contract, and eventually win a federal job of their own. And that means more work and a new customer for small businesses everywhere.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and extend my remarks.
Gentlelady from Wisconsin is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the middle-class workers in Wisconsin and across the country who have unfairly been paying a higher tax rate than millionaires and billionaires. Middle-class Americans deserve to know that our tax system has not been rigged against them. Powerful special interests have manipulated our tax code to make sure that the wealthiest Americans don't have to pay their fair share. These loopholes and special provisions have made it so that billionaire Warren Buffett's secretary pays a higher tax rate than he does. In fact, approximately a quarter of all millionaires pay lower effective tax rates than middle-class families. Yesterday, I introduced the Paying a Fair Share Act, H.R. 3903, which would make the Buffett rule law and ensure that middle-class workers do not pay higher tax rates than those earning more than $1 million a year. I invite my colleagues to join me in taking this common-sense first step to strengthen middle-class families and rebuild our economy with a commitment to shared responsibility. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the 1 minute. It's the tax code that brings me down to the House floor today, if you care about special interest tax breaks in this town, there is only one bill in the U.S. House of Representatives that eliminates every single special interest tax break in the United States Code. Every break, every exception, every exemption, every favor. That's H.R. 25, the fair tax, Mr. Speaker. You know about the fair tax. It's the most widely co-sponsored fundamental tax reform proposal in the entire U.S. House of Representatives. It's the most widely co-sponsored fundamental tax reform proposal in the entire United States Senate. And it is the only bill in Congress that solves every single special interest break, the only one. And it brings American manufacturing jobs back to America. Puts the American manufacturing community on a level playing field with our foreign competitors, the only bill in Congress that gets that done. Mr. Speaker, if you want to see more about it, you can see it at www.thomas.gov. You can see it at www.fairtax.org. It is H.R. 25, and it will save this American economy. And I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from the District of Columbia seek recognition? Gentlelady seek unanimous consent?
By unanimous consent.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the party line from Republican leaders is that Republicans agree on a payroll tax cut holiday. They just need to find a way to pay for it. But Republican members speak a different language. Georgia Republican Paul Braun told the press, quote, "The payroll tax holiday is just a gimmick to get Obama reelected," end quote. That would be news to the average American family who will see their taxes increase by $1,000 on March 1st without a payroll tax agreement. The press reports a serious Republican split with only a 50-50 chance that Republicans can get their members to agree on a payroll tax deal. Line that 50-50 Republican split up against their near unanimous opposition to having wealthy and corporate taxpayers contribute 1 dime to deficit reduction. I'll leave it to the Republican leadership to reconcile these issues and their caucus. Meanwhile, the clock ticks louder each day. Republicans have 22 days to make up their minds on whether every worker who draws a paycheck deserves a tax cut. Yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, members of Congress and others will see 1,000 women of color visiting all of our office. They call themselves the Delta Sorority. And here the leadership is provided by Judge Fudge as they come close to celebrating their 100th anniversary. They have a legislative agenda, a community agenda, a civic agenda, and one of the things they like to point out is that today we recognize the terrible epidemic of AIDS and IV problems that we have with blood. We hope that we learn to educate more people about the danger of AIDS, that we provide better treatment, and even better than that, that we avoid it by having preventive measures so it doesn't happen at all. Also on their agenda is making certain that the payroll deductions for working poor people are extended, that unemployment compensation, which is not only fiscally but morally the right thing to do, and that we pay our debts, pay the doctors that serve the aged. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
By way of unanimous consent to address this honorable body for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today with my Democratic colleagues, ready to work for all Americans. Unfortunately, this no-show Tea Party Republican Congress, which worked only 6 days during the entire month of January, is once again refusing to do its job. You see, at the end of February, taxes will increase for 160 million middle-class Americans unless the Mitt Romney Tea Party Republicans drop their incessant demands to cut taxes for millionaires and billionaires. I ask my Tea Party colleagues to stop holding the payroll tax cut hostage. We must protect unemployment insurance and fix the Medicare payment schedule so that seniors can see the doctor of their choice. It's time for this Tea Party brinksmanship to come to an end, for Republicans to come to work, and for this Congress to go to work for the American people, not just the millionaires and billionaires. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from American Samoa seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to extend and revise my remarks.
Gentleman from American Samoa is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, just recently President Obama offered a plan to reduce the high costs of higher education by putting pressures on colleges and universities to reduce tuition rates. Under the plan, colleges would be rewarded based on their ability to offer relatively lower tuition fees, provide value, and serve low-income students. This plan also coincides with key proposals by President Obama to make higher education more affordable, including President Obama's announcement last fall to consolidate federal student loans and lower interest rates to help colleges, graduates pay off their debt. Mr. Speaker, the American dream is all about providing Americans the opportunity to succeed if they work hard. Every American family should be able to afford higher education. Every young person should have a chance. I commend President Obama for his commitment to American families and for making higher education an economic imperative. And I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
1 minute.
Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the founding co-chair of the Congressional HIV/AIDS Caucus, I rise to recognize National Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day. While I believe every day should be HIV Awareness Day, February 7th is an important day to recognize the effect this epidemic has on African Americans. Although only 14% of the U.S. population, African Americans account for almost half of those living and dying with HIV and AIDS in this country. This year's theme, I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper. People of faith know it's unacceptable that a woman of color in the United States is 15 times more likely to be living with HIV than a white woman her age. People of faith know that it's unacceptable that our young men, particularly gay and bisexual men, are most affected in this country. We cannot allow this crisis to continue. Mr. Speaker, we have the tools we need to end the AIDS epidemic. I urge everyone to get tested and take steps to protect themselves from the virus. I call on members of the faith community, the private sector, health organizations, community leaders, teachers, parents, and the media to come together like never before. The story of African Americans is one of resilience. I have great hope and expectation that we can once again persevere and that we can stamp HIV and AIDS from the face of the earth.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 539 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 110, House Resolution 539. Resolved, that at any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill, H.R. 3581, to amend the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985 to increase transparency in federal budgeting and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Budget. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Budget, now printed in the bill, it shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 112-13. That amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. All points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute are waived. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. All points of order against such amendments are waived. At the conclusion of consideration of the bill for amendment, the committee shall rise and report the bill to the House with such amendments as may have been adopted. Any member may demand a separate vote in the House on any amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole to the bill or to the amendment in the nature of a substitute made in order as original text. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill, and amendments thereto to final passage without intervening motion, except one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of debate only, I'd like to yield the customary 30 minutes to my friend from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, pending which time I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
And during consideration of this resolution, all time is yielded for the purpose of debate only. About House Resolution 539. This resolution provides a structured rule for the consideration of H.R. 3581, the Budget and Accounting Transparency Act. This is another bill in a series of 10 bills that the Budget Committee is sending forward, Mr. Speaker, to try to align the kind of accounting and budgeting that we do in Washington with the kind of accounting and budgeting that happens in the real world. We know transparency and sound accounting matter. We know that it matters on Wall Street. We know that it matters on Main Street. And it matters right here between Independence and Constitution Avenue, Mr. Speaker. This bill has 3 primary provisions. Number 1, it provides transparency by bringing off-budget items on budget. Now, for folks who don't follow this as closely as you and I do, Mr. Speaker, you know that when things are off budget, their degree of scrutiny is changed. When things are off budget, the impact they have on the American taxpayer is not always reflected. When we take those things from off budget and bring them on budget, we begin to show the American taxpayer the real cost of their risk and responsibility. Number 2, it reforms the accounting method that we use to calculate how at risk American taxpayers are under federal credit programs, again, to bring us closer to private sector models. Mr. Speaker, as you well know, when a dollar goes out the door from this United States Capitol, when a dollar goes out the door from the United States Treasury, if it is a loan program, there is no guarantee that dollar comes back. Are most folks faithful payers? Yes, they are. But does every dollar come back? No, it doesn't. Do we need to look further than Fannie and Freddie to see that model? For the first time, we'll begin to account for that risk so that the American taxpayer understands when their American government guarantees a loan what potential impact that has on their pocketbook at home. And finally, Mr. Speaker, it requires all federal agencies to post their budget justifications online in a timely manner. Now, you saw last week, Mr. Speaker, we were able to pass the Baseline Reform Act, which said no longer will we just assume every agency is going to spend more. For the first time, we will say that every agency needs to justify any increases that they receive in their budget. What this provision does is go one step further to say when you are producing that budget, post your justifications online. Let the American people in. Mr. Speaker, if we have nothing to hide in this institution, then continuing to publish more and more information so that the American people can come into this discussion process is only going to lead us in the right direction. Taken together, these three reforms bring the kind of attention that we need to a budget process that has been long broken. We cannot make America's future brighter and more secure if we continue to escalate the debt that we pass on to our children and their grandchildren. Clearly, this body has struggled in years past to contain that debt, both sides of the aisle. Clearly, folks occupying 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue have struggled to contain that debt on both sides of the aisle. Mr. Speaker, the folks who see these issues with clarity live back home in my 7th District of Georgia. They understand what it means to do budgeting around the family dinner table. I know my colleague from Massachusetts has those same folks living in his district facing those same challenges in his district. And if we can bring those people into the discussion, Mr. Speaker, if we can just be honest with our constituents back home about the magnitude of the problem, we will have their support and their involvement to turn this page for America's financial future. Mr. Speaker, we can't stick our heads in the sand. Next week, we're expecting the budget from the White House to arrive here on Capitol Hill. We're expecting it this week. They delayed it to next week. I'm excited about it. I say to my colleague from Massachusetts, Mr. Speaker, I believe we're going to have a serious budget discussion with the White House for the first time in the 3 years of this administration. We're going to have a serious budget dropped on our doorstep, and then the Budget Committee is going to be involved in a serious discussion about how to bring the White House's priorities and the House's priorities in line with the American people's priorities. That process does not happen in a vacuum. That process happens in the sunshine, the bright daylight that is this U.S. House chamber, Mr. Speaker, and with this reform, combined with the other 9 reforms coming out of the Budget Committee, we are taking steps forward to change forever the way this town does its budgeting business. I'm very proud to sit on both the Rules Committee and the Budget Committee, to have had a hand both in the underlying legislation and this resolution today. I urge all of my colleagues to support this resolution, Mr. Speaker, so that we can bring up the underlying bill. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Georgia for yielding me the customary 30 minutes. And I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me begin by urging a no vote on this rule, which is not open, and a no vote on the underlying bill. The bill before us does nothing to improve the quality of life for any American. It doesn't create a single job. Not one job is created by this bill we're talking about today. This bill is going nowhere in the United States Senate. I don't believe this is a serious effort, and in short, we're wasting our time. Mr. Speaker, I cannot stress this enough. Congress must keep our focus on the most important priority facing the American people, and that is jobs. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Democrats may sound like a broken record, but that's because we know that the core issue of our time is the economy and jobs. We need to do more to make sure that America's businesses get back on track and that the American people are in a position to succeed when these businesses start to hire. Now, we had some good news last week. The unemployment rate decreased for the 5th month in a row, falling to 8.3%. At the same time, we've had 5 straight months of job creation, and we're in the 23rd consecutive month of private sector growth. The economy looks like it's rebounding, and if this trend holds, that's a good thing. But while private sector employers added 257,000 jobs in January, there was a loss of 14,000 government jobs, including 11,000 local government jobs. The reason for that, Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, is because the federal government is cutting away and state governments are cutting away. And these so-called government jobs are being eliminated, the jobs that my friends on the other side of the aisle like to demonize. But what are these local government jobs? Mr. Speaker, these are cops, firefighters, teachers, librarians, and trash collectors. They're not faceless bureaucrats. They are people who make our lives safer, better, and cleaner every day. And they are our neighbors and our friends and our family members. So despite the relatively good news about the improving economy, we are clearly not where we need to be. Payroll employment is still 5.6 million jobs short of where it was at the beginning of the Great Recession in December 2007. There are 4 jobless workers for every job opening, and long-term unemployment is still at historic high levels. It is clear that this rebound, as slow and painstaking as it is taking place in spite of House Republicans and in spite of their policies, not because of them. In fact, I believe actions taken and policies voted on by this House have slowed down this economic recovery, have slowed down this economy, and have prevented a faster and more robust recovery. For example, congressional Republicans should be doing all they can to prevent a tax increase on middle-class Americans. Congressional Republicans should be doing all they can to extend unemployment insurance for people who are unemployed at no fault of their own. Yet, Mr. Speaker, they continue to drag their feet on this legislation and, in fact, continue to bicker among themselves about the need to extend these programs. This should be a no-brainer. This should be something that both sides should come together and be able to prove immediately. Yet it has become this theater, this drama that plays out, and nobody quite knows how it's going to end. Mr. Speaker, we're 1 week into February, more than 1 month into the new year, more than 13 months into the new Republican-controlled Congress, and we have yet to see one meaningful jobs bill. No wonder Congress's approval rating is at historic lows. And instead of bringing legislation to the floor that would help the economy, like a clean extension of the payroll tax and unemployment insurance, the GOP would rather bring up misguided budget bills that simply attempt to rig the budget rules so they can score cheap political points. House Republicans are simply trying to change the rules of the game to benefit their own point of view. This bill today, the so-called Budget and Accounting Transparency Act, is another sham bill in the Republican leadership's quest to change the rules of budgeting. This may seem like inside baseball to some, but it really is something quite extraordinary. Simply, the Republicans, with this bill, are attempting to artificially inflate the cost of federal credit programs. They do so by changing the way government credit programs are calculated. The federal budget is supposed to count the amount of money that is spent and the revenue received. If there is more money coming in than going out, it's a surplus. The opposite is a deficit. What the Republican leadership is trying to do with this bill is to recalculate the way these credit programs are scored or counted in the budget process, automatically making them more expensive. They do so by treating government credit programs in a similar way to private credit programs, even though they are treated differently by the markets. Now, on top of changing the way these credit programs are scored, it's important to point out that this bill doesn't apply to all federal programs. In other words, we would have one set of scoring rules for one set of federal programs and another one just for the federal credit programs. That doesn't make any sense to me. If some of these recent budget bills are any indication, the House Republican leadership cares more about rigging the budget process just to dismantle the federal safety net instead of actually working to reduce the deficit and at the same time spur job creation. Mr. Speaker, we should be talking about jobs. We should be acting on the President's jobs plan. Our committee work should be focused on how do we get this economy running again. What should be on the floor today is not a bill that's going nowhere, but a bill that will help put people back to work. If we put more people back to work and this economy begins to recover more, then we can grow out of this deficit. And I would just, again, urge the Republican leadership to stop bringing stuff to the floor that really, I believe, is a waste of our time. Bring things to the floor that are meaningful, that will make a difference in the lives of the American people, that will improve the quality of lives for people in this country. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this rule and on the underlying bill, and to put our focus back where it belongs, creating a stronger economy for the American people. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume to say to my colleague from Massachusetts, I always look for those areas of agreement because I know that we have some. I know that we have some, and I had a tough time finding those areas of agreement in that particular presentation, but when you got to your discussion about the theater that takes place on this House floor, I begin to feel that personal bond, Mr. Speaker, because this feels like theater to me. This is a rule that my friend is urging a no vote on that does one thing and one thing only. It brings to the floor a budget-changing provision that will shine more of a spotlight on what it is this Congress does when it comes to spending the American people's money. It does one thing and one thing only, and that is to give the American taxpayer more insight into what it is that my colleagues and I are doing with the money that we have taken from them. Now, you might say, Mr. Speaker, well, what if I oppose that sunshine? What if I don't want daylight in the process? What if I have some things up here that I don't want folks to know I'm doing with their money? Fair enough. You can vote no on the underlying bill. But this rule, Mr. Speaker, this rule which governs the debate on the House floor has made in order every single Democratic amendment that was germane to the underlying legislation. Hear that. Hear that. For folks who don't like the way the bill was crafted, of course, we had a full hearing and markup in the Budget Committee, but for folks who don't like the way that bill came out, sometimes Congresses in the past would just shove a bill to the floor and say, take it or leave it. But this bill, Mr. Speaker, is coming to the floor with a rule that said, tell me, colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, tell me how it is that we can make this bill better, and every single idea and suggestion that was germane to the underlying bill, this rule makes in order. So I ask you, Mr. Speaker, why vote no on this rule? If you don't like the underlying legislation, vote no on the underlying legislation. But this rule is a rule that this entire House can be proud of, and I'm proud to be able to carry it for the Rules Committee today. I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, let me give myself such time as I may consume. The reason why people should vote no on this rule is because it's not an open rule, number one. The other reason why people should vote no on this rule is because it enables bad behavior. And the bad behavior is bringing up bills that are going nowhere that aren't very serious. What we should be bringing to the floor right now is a clean extension of the payroll tax cut for middle-class Americans, and the extension of unemployment insurance. That's what we should be talking about. That's what should be on the floor right now. And instead, that measure, which will actually help people, is bogged down in conference because of ideological battles that my right-wing friends choose to wage. What we should be doing on this floor is putting the American people back to work and helping grow this economy through creating more jobs. The bill before us does nothing to address the critical challenges facing America's families. It doesn't create a single job. It does nothing to address our serious budgetary challenges. This bill does not increase revenues or reduce spending, and thus does nothing to cut this deficit. We are sitting here talking about something that really is going nowhere, and it really doesn't matter in the scheme of things. We should be talking about jobs and how we get this economy moving again. With that, Mr. Speaker, it is my privilege to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 4 minutes. Without objection, gentleman is recognized.
I thank my friend for yielding the time. The month the President took office, the U.S. economy was in the midst of a horrible collapse into oblivion for a lot of American families. The economy lost 700,000 jobs the month the President took office. Last Friday, we had the news that the economy gained over 250,000 private sector jobs. This is welcome news, but we have a lot of work to do. This is not nearly sufficient to restore the American dream to America's middle class and really fuel the kind of recovery that we need. Now, the President came to this floor 152 days ago with specific ideas that both parties had agreed to over the years to try to fuel the small businesses and entrepreneurs who are the fuel of the American economy. And he came to the floor with four ideas. The first was to cut taxes for small businesses that hire people, something people on both sides say they're for. We've never taken a vote on that idea. Never. Since then. Second, he came to the floor with an idea that as teachers are being laid off from the classroom and firefighters are being laid off from our first responders and police officers are being taken off the street, why don't we help the cities and towns and states with a little bit of help to keep some of those people on the job, not only so they can do their job, but so they can spend money in the stores and the restaurants and help small business. We have never taken a vote on that idea in those 152 days. The third thing the President said is, let's put construction workers back to work, building libraries of the future for our schools, repairing the crumbling roads and bridges of the country, making sure rural America is wired for the Internet. And those construction workers would then become the customers of the small stores and the restaurants, the appliance stores that make America go. We have never taken a vote on that idea in the last 152 days. And finally, the President said, let's avoid a massive tax increase on the middle-class people of this country that was scheduled to go into effect on January 1st of this year. Well, we sort of took a vote on that, and we're able to, dredge out of that process a 2-month extension to avoid that massive tax increase. That extension ends 22 days from today. In the 2 months since then, there's not been one proposal on the floor to fix that problem. What we have on the floor today is a very interesting bill, and I frankly commend the seriousness of it. The bill essentially says we should re-examine the method by which we value guarantees issued by the federal government when we account for them in our budget. In other words, if you co-sign a note for someone, how should that show up on your balance sheet? That's essentially what this bill is about. Now, this is a serious question, but I think the unemployed carpenter and the small business owner about to close her store and the police officer who got his pink slip last week thinks it's a pretty irrelevant question. And what they would rather have us do is vote yes or no on cutting taxes for small businesses that create jobs. We vote yes. Yes or no on putting police officers, firefighters, teachers back to work. We vote yes. Yes or no on helping the middle class by avoiding a massive tax increase on the American people. Yes or no? What we ought to be doing is bringing those questions to the floor, and having a debate. Instead, we're having a debate that's serious, but it really belongs at the American Society of CPAs, not the House of Representatives. Let's get to work on the questions we're hearing at home, yes or no. We say yes to fueling the middle-class job creators, the small